When I say the statement, we need to put on the whole armor of God, chances are you already know what I'm talking about, right? I mean, how many times have you heard about this armor that Paul talks about in Ephesians 6:10 through 17? This passage was brought up in our community group a few weeks ago, and which led me back to reading it all over again. And something new stuck out to me that I hadn't thought of before. Paul begins this section with saying, "Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might." And then he goes on to talk about each piece of the armor. But he said, "Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might." This really stuck out to me, and I thought this is the key to the entire armor being effective, right? This is our equipping. This is our basic training, so to speak, before we can even put on the armor and go to war. I immediately thought about David when I read this, and about that day when this teenage boy who came to a battle to bring his brother some cheese ended up killing a giant. And before he went out on that field, King Saul put some armor on him to help protect him, but it didn't quite fit right, so he ended up taking it off. He instead approached Goliath wearing the spiritual armor of God. You see, David knew who God was, and he knew that God would give him the faith and the strength and the courage to literally run at his enemy and defeat him. And then we see the opposite happen with the same guy, with David. Years later, when he's still running from Saul, he began to rely on his own strength, and in that resulted in a failure. See, he stopped strengthening himself first in the Lord, which made him weak, which made his mind weak. And in 1 Samuel 27:1, it says, "Then David said in his heart, 'Now I shall perish by the hand of Saul.'" I mean, it was like he'd forgotten everything that God had told him, how God had promised him that he was going to be the chosen king of Israel, that he was going to be a great king someday. How many times do we speak things into our hearts or our own minds that don't quite match up what God is telling us? In this time of David not leaning on God's strength, his family and the families of all of his men were kidnapped, and their homes, their whole town was destroyed. His men who followed him everywhere, they loved him so much, and they were ready to stone him to death. They were willing to kill him over this. David was at a low point, basically at his rock bottom. But in his weakness, he remembered the Lord's promises. And in 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, it says, "But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." And because of that, because he strengthened himself in the Lord his God, him and his men were able to go and defeat their enemy and save their wives and children. You see, without being strengthened in the Lord first, our armor is useless. He is our strength. It's the strength of his might, not ours, that defeats our enemies. Without being strengthened in his might first, it's basically like putting on armor made out of tinfoil, right? It might look cool, but it's completely useless. My encouragement to you in this is that this hope, this promise, it's renewed every day. So begin your day, every day, strengthening yourself in the Lord your God. Look to him first before everything else. Because the word says, our enemy prowls around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. But this lion that's trying to destroy us, he's on a leash. He can only do so much, and much less if we are clothed in the armor strengthened by God's might. So be encouraged. God will give you the strength that you need for any battle. Because without his strength, our armor, our hearts, our minds are weakened. Rely on God's written word. There are so many verses relating to strengthening yourself in the Lord. He will equip you and prepare you for any battle that you will face. And why? Because he loves you. He loves you. Be encouraged, church. I love you guys.